Today, we go on a journey with writer and game designer Luke Miller.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Now, hey guys, I have an awesome interview coming up, but first, really quickly, if you are getting bogged down in your game master or dungeon master prep time, and you want to have more fun at the table, I have some books for you. I create the books of random tables. These books help you fill in the details of your campaign right at the table by having your players roll, so you don't have to spend time beforehand coming up with all the little details about every little possible thing that could be in some room somewhere in the dungeon you are exploring. Now, I have tables for fantasy, science fiction, cyberpunk, modern, Wild West, and many, many more. You can find those at Amazon.com, DriveThruRPG.com, and my own website, DiceGeeks.com. All you have to do is search for the Book of Random Tables, and you will find them. Now, here's today's interview. My guest today is writer and game designer Luke Miller. Luke, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be on.
No problem. It's my pleasure. So, Luke, how were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, man. I have been interested in tabletop role-playing games for about as long as I can remember. Ever since I kind of learned about this game called Dungeons and Dragons when I was younger, I was just like, that sounds like such a cool idea. I've been a fantasy reader for so long that to be able to get into that story and be in that story always sounded like a really cool idea. I unfortunately, for a long time, had this mental block about, I am maybe not the coolest person in school as a teenager. And, I like nerdy stuff and I'm in band. And I had this really unfortunate mentality about it. But at least I don't play D&D, which I look back and I cringe so hard at that thought process. But because I just missed out on so much. And over the years, I've always I've heard about it and I've learned about it here and there and never had a lot of exposure to it. But in the last couple of years, it's clearly tabletop role-playing games have had a bit of a, not a resurgence, but a surgence, I suppose, into kind of into pop culture. And with the rise of shows like, Critical Role or YouTube creators like Matt Colville, I started getting more and more exposure to this world of tabletop role-playing games and what it looks like and what they can be. And they're more than just one thing and different people play them differently. And there's this huge world of different games out there, not just Dungeons and Dragons. And it struck me, and that kind of just struck a spark. And I started realizing oh man, I've wasted so much time not playing these games. I should have been playing them forever. And so, right when the pandemic hit, I found myself, on Discord looking for maybe groups to play with. And I was in a server and this one person, she reached out and said, "Hey, I'm going to have a game for new people. I saw that you were posting. Are you interested?" And I immediately was like, yeah, I couldn't type fast enough. Yes, get me in there. I'm ready to play. And I just so happened I found the best group to play with. And we've been playing every week since. And it's just been a matter one after the other, starting to buy game books, and I have fallen into that trap that a lot of people I know fall into, that I have all of these game books and I've only played one of them, but they're just so much fun to read and play and do all kinds of just stuff. There's so many stories to be told out there, and so that's kind of how I slowly came to the hobby.
All right. Well, that's I have a number of things there I want to follow up on, but it is interesting that you have only been playing then as we're recording this, for about a year or so. That is really interesting. like I said, I do have a few things to follow up on,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and maybe a little resentment too, because since I started playing when I was 9 and I was playing all the way through high school, I was one of those kids, right? Like I was the kid, who played D&D and everybody looked at me weird. But I would on Monday back from school, some guy would be like, "Hey, Matt, what did you do this weekend? I partied and got drunk and all this stuff. What did you do?" And I'd be like, I watched a lot of Star Trek and wished I had somebody to play D&D with.
Oh, but like man, Matt, here's the thing though. Like, I was totally that kid too, and that's the thing that kills me. It's like I was reading all the fantasy novels. I had my deck of Magic cards that I didn't have anybody to play it with, but I just had so much fun consuming these stories and all of this cool stuff out there. But I just never had the opportunity to take that step, and so I wish I had, man. I would have been having so much fun this whole time.
Yeah. And and I don't regret anything. So it was awesome.
Well, that's good.
When I discovered role-playing games, it was like finding what I was made for. So I am, I'm totally there, and I'm not ashamed.
I love the way you phrase that, because as over the last couple of years, because there was those like 2-year lead up before I finally found a game to play in, and I just finding almost like what you're meant to do. It's like this thing that is just packaged in a way, and you fit into it in such a way that I'm like, this brings together all of my interests into one cool thing, and it just works.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, and I think that is something that is. I've talked with some people about this on the podcast as well. That role-playing games combine, they combine storytelling, novel writing. They combine, such like theater, drama. They combine such a wide-ranging set of interests in one thing, right? Like that it's absolutely, I don't know, it's just absolutely amazing. I think it is possibly wholly unique, like a wholly unique art form, because you can if you have somebody who says, "Oh, I'm a writer," say, "Oh, well, you're going to enjoy tabletop role-playing games." "Oh, I'm an actor." "Oh, you're going to enjoy tabletop role-playing games." "Oh, I'm a musician." "Oh, you're going to enjoy tabletop role-playing games." Like it just goes on and on and on.
Oh, and there's little bits of it everywhere for everyone. And I talk to a lot of people I know. I don't know a lot of in real life gamers, but I'm always pushing it. I'm like, "Oh, you like this thing? Like you should do a game with me. Like this is going to be so much fun," because there really is, throughout the entire spectrum. And, there's such a wide range of games themselves that there's really something out there that anybody can get something out of. If you like telling stories, if you like collaborating, if you like wargaming, if you like writing, like you said, or even voice acting or regular acting, there's just all kinds of cool stuff to do.
Yeah. And, and if you don't like fantasy, or you like fantasy, but you can play science fiction, you can play, a variety of things. Or if you really like Star Wars, you can play a Star Wars game, there is just so many, different things now that you can explore, through the hobby. Is really, really cool. Yeah. And so now you did mention, you said you were a science fiction and fantasy reader from kind of way back. What were some of your favorite books in that?
Oh man, there's I have read a book or two in my day, and I think that to kind of go way back, I think the thing that really initially got me into the fantasy genre was the Dragonlance series, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman's Dragonlance series, and all of the universe that it created. I remember getting into that and just being like, I was reading the book, The Night of the Eye, and it was this first introduction I had to this magic system. And there's the white robes, the red robes, and the black robes, and here's how they're all different. And it's the story of a young man like finding himself interested and intrigued, and finally making his way into this like world of magic. And I just remember being so captivated. Like there's this whole world out there, and I know I'm just seeing a slice of it in this book. And it just hinted at so many other things. And from there, it was just consuming anything I could get when it came to a lot of fantasy. I read like Harry Potter, of course, as a kid, and I loved the whole different take on magic and this world. And again, this like really interesting world that the author built. I ended up getting into the Wheel of Time series, which of course is like a very long series in the scope of a lot of fantasy series. But again, Robert Jordan's world was just such an interesting take, and the challenges that world presents and how the people in it overcome them. There's probably my favorite author of all time, Terry Pratchett, and his Discworld series. I reread that entire series every couple of years just because it consistently makes me laugh. It is such a great, like, weird, funny, satirical take on fantasy, and not even just on the genre, but on our world at large. The way he takes through the lens of the fantasy world, takes such an interesting view on the events that kind of were really impactful on our culture and our societies in general. It's just the way that fantasy does such a good job of spinning these fantastic worlds and these amazing things that the people in these worlds experience, but so many of them do it in a way that also just zooms in on humanity and on interesting stories of people making difficult choices. And something about the fantasy and sci-fi genres have always really spoken to me that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting, though, you had mentioned you had started reading some of the Dragonlands. I've talked to a number of people who say they started reading some of the novels and then didn't even realize it was connected to a role-playing game until much later.
That's exactly me. I had learned, and as I started kind of learning more about D&D and like the background and where it came from, and how it's changed over time, I learned, there's a Dragonlance setting for D&D. And then I started learning more about it. And then you think back through the stories, and there's certain times where like Raistlin uses magic and casts, and in the books, they talk about him casting a certain spell and the way he goes through it and the way he has to like rememorize the spells every day. And I'm like, it's a game. Like they're going through the mechanics of this game. It was so funny to look at that entire series from a different lens that way.
Yeah. And I just find that interesting. Of course, I came to it the other way, right? Before the novels and everything became, I take it from some of the things that you were saying, I am a bit older than you. So, although I don't know why I'm shy about it, I give my age away all the time on the podcast, but, I came at it the other way and then, realized only later that there were novels, and then, looking up, raising my head up in like 1993 or 1995 and noticing that they're New York Times bestselling novels, in fact, and being like, oh, wow. Oh, okay. So that's interesting. Nobody wanted to play, but man, they wanted to read about it at that time.
Yeah, it was just so interesting to realize that, I'd been reading these books ever since I was super young, and then to turn around and be like, wow, that's where this came from. And then it just makes so much sense the way things are presented in them that I look back and I'm like, how did I not realize that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just a quick aside, you mentioned Harry Potter. I'm always kind of curious. I know there's probably a lot of rights issues and stuff, but it's just like if D&D would approach Rowling and make a Harry Potter campaign setting book, they could just like print $2 billion. It's just like print it. Like, you don't even have to worry. You don't even have to worry about it, right? So,
and there's all kinds of additional merchandising.
Yeah, exactly.
All
Dice.
kinds of things you could do. Yeah,
I know. So I always think about that. I was just like, man, somebody should pitch that. Somebody should pitch that idea. But maybe they probably already thought of it. But anyway, that was just a little aside. But I mean, that's just a money printing machine if they were to do
absolutely
that. Yeah. And then you did mention too, you were talking about a surgence, you kind of called it, instead of a resurgence, although I would kind of classify it as a resurgence of tabletop role-playing games, that we're in possibly the second golden age of role-playing games. Because I remember, from the early 80s when I started playing when I was 9, and it was super popular. Everybody, a lot of people were playing it, and then the Star Wars role-playing game, the old West End series, kind of carried the torch of role-playing games. But then in the early 90s, right, when Magic came out, I had conversations with my friends like, will anybody role play again? Like they're just going to always play the card games,
Yeah.
But of course, then that market crashes, and then we get kind of this now with streaming and everything, this rebirth of tabletop role playing games, and I'm wondering too, just like some things thinking about that a little bit. I think that might have to do with people realizing that we can really connect with people when we're playing these games, that we can really connect with people and tell shared stories together. And I think it just creates bonds between people. And we, that some people on the outside didn't realize that years ago, that it was like, I have some old friends that I haven't seen now in years, but I could send them a message on Facebook. Like I'm talking maybe 30 years ago, and I haven't seen them, but I'm friends with them on Facebook. I could send them a message, like 1 word, 2 words, and they would send me back a message with 10 paragraphs talking about how they remember this time that we played something in 1992 or whatever it was.
Yeah, it's that shared experience that you get to go through, and you're, like you said, it's this kind of collaborative. You're telling this story, and I know there's some disagreement in, I think, the wider community of, is, for instance, D&D, is that a storytelling medium? Is playing this game telling a story? And I think there's definitely things to be said for both sides of that argument. Personally, the way I like to play is exactly the way with what you're talking about. It's getting together with this group of people that you like spending time with, or maybe a brand new group of people that you want to get to know. And by playing through the actions and making these choices and getting invested in this story, you connect with these people in a whole different way. And I think it's a way that kind of calling back to what we were talking about before, to me feels really unique, and it feels really powerful, because you start to feel a connection to your character, or to this group of characters, or this world at large, or all of the above even. And as you make these hard choices, and you are presented with challenges, and you think creatively, and you learn more about each other's characters, and you come out the other side of this with all of these new connections to this group of people. And I think you're right. I think there are a lot of preconceived notions, previously held and still currently held by a lot of people, about the kind of tabletop role-playing game experience of what it is. It's not just rolling dice and swinging a sword at a goblin, which, don't get me wrong, is a lot of fun. But it's definitely not all of it. And I think there are more and more examples of that coming up all the time, that people are starting to kind of perk up, like I did, and be like, there's more to this, and I want to get to know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, I don't think it's, a coincidence to realize, when I start, especially, doing this podcast and talking to a lot of people who are game designers, who are role players, who are writers, there is this draw to people who want to do something creative, who end up in creative careers, or who on the side at least do something, creatively. I'm not, I'm just not shocked by that, but it took me a while to kind of realize that, because when I talk to, somebody, like if I go to a convention or something and I see somebody has a table and they have novels laid out on the table and they say, hey, I'm writing these books, I can, a lot of the time, I could just make up a number, but I would say, like 80% of the time I could look at them and say, did you play Dungeons and Dragons like in like 80 something to like 1990 something? And they're like, yes, I did, and it's just like, it's just like, I'm not shocked by that, because people who have, this kind of attunement to stories and wanting to do something creative, like role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, is just like that. It is just made for those people.
And it's such a multidisciplinary type of hobby too, where, again, like we talked about earlier, if you're a creative person and you have an interest somewhere in this broad scope of the tabletop role-playing game landscape, there is something in there that you're going to be able to grab onto and be like, oh man, I want to create this thing in this context, and it's going to be something that people can interact with in a fully different way than they might in other types of hobbies or other types of formats. And it's just so cool. Like, I get so excited talking about it just because it's this creative endeavor that there's just really nothing like it. And you get to be able to create something that people get to sink into. A book, you get to sink into a story in a book, but you're seeing what's happening as it goes. And it's almost like the literary version of watching a movie in some ways. It's different, but when you're playing in a role-playing game and you're playing through this setting that somebody has crafted, you're interacting with it in a very direct way, and you're engaging your imagination in a totally different way than you might with something like a book. And it's just to be able to create something that somebody gets to then sit with and to interact with and get excited about and get passionate about. And it's a fascinating process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I know, like, you were talking about how you read a lot. Now, my story is a little bit different, right? Like, I struggled with reading when I was a kid, but I consumed movies and television shows, and I wanted kind of that feeling, even though I struggled with reading, and I didn't really kick up my reading a notch until I was in my early 20s. And I'm trying to make up for lost time. So I'm trying to read a lot. But, that's what I would kind of sell role playing to some of my friends every once in a while. It's just like, hey, it's just like, we're sitting here and we're like going to make a movie, right? In our heads, we're going to write a book in our heads. That's like, and it could be as epic as we want because there's no budget, right? There's no budget.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no budget. There's no restrictions. No publisher is saying, oh, kids don't want to read about this thing or whatever. It's just like, whatever we want to put into it. And you can make like a big guy who hits things with a sword all day long, or, and that's usually how we started. But, things would start to evolve and we would realize that, actually we can tell a pretty intricate story, even at, age 13 or 14, with a game here, that most of the rules are about hitting things with, with a sword, or a magic bolt or something, that we can actually tell some really intricate stories with this, and have basically our own place in our own world that we can, explore. And I just thought it was, just an incredible outlet because, I was sitting making up all the worlds and everything anyway, trying to tell the stories in my head anyway. Well, the role-playing game just gave you the medium to do that with your friends.
Yeah, it gives you such a good way to pull other people into that place as well. I think you touched on something really interesting, and I hadn't really kind of placed it and slotted it into my brain this way until you phrased it, until you were just discussing it. There is a sense of place, I feel like, that playing in something like a role-playing game can offer, especially, and this is one of those things that now I'm thinking like, oh, I was hungry for this as a kid, a sense of place and ownership where you're able to step into this world that, maybe it's a campaign setting, like the Forgotten Realms that has so fleshed out and has already been created, but you get to form your own little space within this place, and you get to be there with your friends, and you get to tell cool stories, and you get to do heroic things. And it's such a cool, I keep calling it a cool thing. It's just this really, it's this really amazing way to interact with a story, but also with this sense of ownership and of finding a place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is an interesting, take, as well, because it kind of gave me my place, right? Like, I didn't fit in with the popular kids at school. I wasn't doing the things they were doing. I wasn't, I didn't fit in with, this other group at school or whatever, I didn't fit in a lot there, but in my group, I fit in, right? And we were, we kind of all knew what we were, we all had our, specific places in that little world, and we belong there, right? We belong there.
Yeah.
And I just always thought that was interesting. That it gave me a place. Yeah, it gave me a place to create. Which some of the the other kids weren't doing, right? They didn't sit down and try to create worlds and characters and things, even before they started playing role-playing games. That's what I was doing, right? Like that's what I was doing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's and there were times in my life, I think, where I thought, well, maybe that kept me away from fitting in, because I played it kind of kept me, from fitting in. But as I've gotten older and I don't really care what people think, too much, I was like, no, actually that helped me, develop some of the skills that I need now in what I do for a living. Right. Like, it helped me develop those things. And in fact, I just wrote my first novel. It took me a long time, but, I've got it in editing and stuff right now. And it's just like, I couldn't have done that if I hadn't played Dungeons and Dragons when I was 9 years old. I just couldn't have.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about that. Like, did it keep me from fitting in, or did it? I was the gay kid in high school. I was out at 12, and so I wasn't gonna fit in necessarily at my relatively rural high school in a lot of ways. And I really look at the fantasy and sci-fi worlds that I would dive into through reading as this way to find a place that I could fit. And, back in the 90s and 2000s, there wasn't a lot of places where I necessarily saw myself per se, but it really gave me that kind of outlet. And I can just imagine, again, I'm just like, oh man, I should have been playing this back then, because I could have created a world in which my day-to-day maybe wasn't necessarily somewhere that I felt like I slotted in. But I could have created this place that I was already really doing, just in a totally more immersive way, that it would have been a place for me to be. And it's really interesting to think about that as creating your own space.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now you were not content just playing the game, right? You have started designing. Why don't you tell us about Journey a little bit?
Oh yeah, no, I even before I started playing, I was already, I got really into the idea of being a DM, and I didn't want to just play. I wanted to lead the game. I may shock you, as I have been on talking with you for now. I like to talk and I like to create. And so if this is a place where I could sit and I've got a captive audience for however many hours we're going to be playing, and I can tell them about the cool stuff I'm making, right? And so it's this. Yeah. It was. Even from the jump, I was ready to start getting in and creating a world, creating a setting, taking all of the settings I've created through all of my writing projects over my life and shoehorn everything in. And so it was immediately exciting. And then as I finally got into a game and started feeling it out, and as I finally in the last few months have been DMing my own campaign with that same group, it has been such a learning experience, and understanding what do I like out of these games and what is it about this storytelling medium that I enjoy. And then starting to connect it back to, it's funny you say you just finished your novel. I've been writing however many novels for so long, and I've not quite finished any of them because I just get so excited about all these ideas and I have to go to the new shiny novel idea. But it was this moment of, how can I take these different pieces that I'm enjoying about this experience and kind of meld them together. And it was around that time that I also started learning more about kind of the solo gaming experience and playing with like the Mythic GM emulator and finding these different tools that allow how you can sit down by yourself and approximate some of these experiences, and realizing like, man, I've been doing this my whole life when it comes to writing. I've been sitting down and thinking, I have this fantasy world, and what does it look like? What would it be like to walk along the street of this city? And using those to inform some of the flavor decisions, but also a lot of plot decisions. Stepping into the shoes of your main character and thinking X, Y, and Z is happening. How would she react to those things? Or if she reacted this way, what would be the greater effect? And so it was kind of a slow crystallization of this idea of how I went about world building, and realizing that I could totally take that and codify that into a mechanic that I could finally tell other people that here's how I do this thing, and it really works for me. And where previously I sometimes found it was a little hard to put that into words, by thinking of it in the context of a solo role-playing game, of this thing that you sit down and you go through these steps and you follow these processes, and you roll some dice and you draw some cards to get some randomness and find some inspiration. It finally gelled into this thing that I'm like, oh man, this is exactly what I do, in a way that I can package it up and show it to other people. And so it has been a really exciting experience to take this thing out of my head and put it onto paper in a way that people are really responding to. So Journey is that. Journey is this idea of, I have a world, and it could be a world for a campaign setting. It could be a world for a novel or a screenplay or anything, any place that you want to understand a little bit better and you want to get more inspired by. And the idea is that you step into the shoes of somebody in that place. So an example would be like a fantasy novel. You think there's a lot of action happening in the city, and I think there's a lot of different settings out there, and I want this place to feel more real. It's feeling a little flat in my writing. I don't really know what that wants to look like. And for somebody like me, I immediately run in like 10 different directions and start talking about like currency and economic history, and I get world builder's disease real quick. Where Journey allows you to step into that role, define your setting of this fantasy city, and then start getting inspiration bit by bit through the framework of the game. And you choose your setting, and there's things called waypoints in the game, which are the places, people, or things that you step towards in the context of this place and examine a little bit more closely. And once you find, there's different types of waypoints, like architectural or historical, and they're very open-ended. They're very, depending on your setting, an architectural waypoint could be something as large as a space station or an artificial planet, or it could be something very focused in a very small setting, like a single room. An architectural thing could be a secret door, or some sort of like bookshelf, or anything inside of this room that kind of fits that. And then through the process of exploration, you draw some cards, and there's lists of aspects for each of these waypoints that just pull out little details, like what is, if the waypoint is a single person, what's a piece of adornment they wear, or what's something they have in their pocket even. And it's these little granular details that start to, if somebody has very little in their pockets, what does that say about the person? What does it say about the group that they belong to, or this place that they're in? And it's been really fascinating to see, both in my playing through this game a lot, because I play it all the time now, because I think it's so interesting to see this process in play. The little details of these places add so much life and add so much depth to these various pieces of a world. And it's been really fascinating to see how different people have used it, and hearing about all the discoveries they've made and how much it's helped people in their writing or developing campaign settings. It's been a really wild ride so far.
Yeah, I can imagine. Obviously, there's a lot of pieces there and stuff that that I'd like to dive into a little bit. So, now you said it uses dice and cards.
Yeah, so the game, you would roll dice to determine a number of things. For instance, at the very beginning of the game, after you've decided your setting, maybe roll a d6. And I kept it simple for this game. It's just relies on d6s. And you determine the type of waypoint that you're looking at using a d6, or you find the number of waypoints that you're going to stop at. The way that the game is built, you draw cards to determine which aspect of a waypoint you're looking at. And so it goes from ace through king. Depending on what you pull from that list, you're able to pull an aspect that you're going to examine more closely. There's even another level of abstraction on those cards, where depending on the suit of the card that you pull, maybe you're looking for something, it colors this aspect that you're looking at in a different way. Maybe there's something about this aspect that is extremely surprising. In the context of this setting, this specific ornamentation on this person that they wear is surprising in some way, or it's mystical or supernatural in some way. And so there's some levels of abstraction that are optional that you can add on top of that to get a little bit more inspiration, right? And so everything in the game is meant to drive to that inspiration that you'll be able to pull out. And when you have something where whatever you're taking notes in is kind of referred to as your traveler's journal, you're able to leave the game with that and have all this inspiration. There are people who use oracle cards. I've had people who used straight up tarot decks. I've had people who use all kinds of different tools. One person said that they use dominoes, and they have tweaked the mechanics a little bit to use dominoes to be able to pull out inspiration. And it's really cool how flexible it is to whatever tool someone wants to use.
Yeah, that's interesting. And now, so it seems like it's kind of solo role playing, but also a writer's tool. I mean, that was something that you kind of went in with. You had that idea to kind of begin with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's packaged as a solo role-playing experience. And there have been people who have done it collaboratively. And I've talked with those folks on what was it about this that you wanted to play it with someone else. And sometimes it's been one-on-one. Some people have used it in their kind of larger D&D groups. But it is at its heart, a creativity tool. And so being presented as a world building tool for writers is kind of one of the main focuses that I've had. So far, it's been very much being presented as a role playing game, but that side of it that allows somebody who's working on a book, or maybe they're 3/4 of the way through the book and they go back and they think, man, I just want to get some more detail about this thing. And maybe even not for their actual writing. Maybe they just want to explore their world a little bit more, which, again, world builder's disease. My name is Luke. I do that all the time, which is why I haven't finished my novels. But to be able to dive into a place that you're thinking, this is really interesting. I want to know more about that. And as a writer, this gives you a really easy to understand and follow process, and a very mechanical process for doing that doesn't get overwhelming. One of my friends and one of the play testers, she was working on a fantasy novel, and she was having a hard time wrapping her head around this kind of transportation system within her city. Mm-hmm. And every time she sat down, it quickly expanded and ballooned a little bit to where it just never really got to the core of the thing that she needed to fix. And by doing this, and by stepping into the shoes of a tourist within the city, she was able to see from the ground, she exactly saw what she needed to fix, and was able to then completely button up that entire process in her city. And so it's just for a writer, and especially for somebody like me who gets distracted easily by all the cool stuff there is to see, it's a proven to be a really interesting way to just zoom in on a very specific thing about this world and experience it in a way that puts you in front of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it sounds really interesting. I do have to, kind of bring up, we talked earlier about how how role-playing games gave us friends and a sense of community, but now this is a solo game. Now, of course, when I was younger, I played a lot solo just because, it was a rainy day and I was home alone or something. And I would just more or less just imagine what I was doing. Right. And in that. But, I did think that was kind of an interesting kind of take on it, because there are times when, we are alone and we don't have access to, somebody else. And it does seem like an interesting way to keep kind of that creative experience going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there are a lot of really fascinating solo experiences out there. And I really encourage anybody who hasn't taken the time to explore playing, there's systems out there to play full on D&D by yourself, or to step into the roles of a DM and have a emulation tool run the role of your players. And I think there is a definite place alongside these collaborative experiences for playing by yourself. I mean, we can't sit down and every night of the week, unfortunately. I mean, we could, but I would never get anything else done. To sit down with my amazing gaming group and play in these worlds that we're creating. But aside from just the entertainment and storytelling value, I think there are so many opportunities for games like Journey to fill a gap, if you're looking for something creative that isn't necessarily a full-on experience, or maybe you can't find a group. It took me a long time to find the right group, but it's a way to kind of scratch that itch, but also dive deeper into these creative spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, kind of looking back on some of my experience, I think, I wish I would have had something like Journey, years ago. I just didn't think about it. We had different, I was stuck in kind of either D&D or kind of Star Wars mode or something like that, and wasn't really thinking about it. But, as I look back on my times, playing by myself, I think what I was doing then is I was training myself, right? Like I was training my mind to think about stories in a certain way, to think about, complications and plots. And, and in a sense, for, kind of way back, I wrote screenplays, years ago. And, I was training myself to write screenplays and write novels, and I didn't really realize that, I think, at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are so many parts of this process that it forces you and it forces your brain to approach these challenges of, especially from a solo player standpoint, how am I going to approximate this randomness? I playing a solo game like Journey, you could cheat and be like, well, everything went great. And if you're playing something like D&D solo, it's like, well, I swung my sword and ooh, that's another critical hit. And so it's really easy to fudge that, but to force yourself into this mindset of going with it and allowing the fiction to inform your decisions. I think it's a great creative opportunity. And I think these solo experiences can work really, really well alongside a larger campaign, right? You can say, I have this campaign world. My current campaign is taking place in the Forgotten Realms. It's in the city of Neverwinter. And there's so much to see in this place, but it can very quickly just turn into background noise. And so using Journey, I've done this a lot with my current campaign because I'm trying to keep finding new things to unearth and be exciting about having everybody be in this one city. It's really interesting to then use this experience alongside that larger experience to gain new inspiration and to think, wow, I'm gonna be a tourist in the city of Neverwinter during this time, and I'm going to find an archaeological waypoint. And what does that look like? And what does that say about the city? And what part of the history does it connect to? And it really just it puts your mind in this creative space while injecting new life into the space that you're in.
Yeah. Do you have, not to put you on the spot, do you have a specific example of how you use Journey to inform your current campaign? Like, whether it was architectural or whatever it was?
Yeah, actually, there is and this is kind of a silly one, and don't tell my players, they haven't quite discovered this yet. The part of Neverwinter's larger canon is this Water Clock Guild, and it's the City of Skilled Hands and the Water Clock Guild. They have a crypt, and so I have this thing that I've created where they're gonna go into this crypt and try to restore part of the initiation rites for this Water Clock Guild, and it's gonna be all this really cool stuff that connects to one of my players' backstories. But by looking at this as an archaeological place where this is a crypt that was built by artificers and by tinkerers, and what kind of interesting things would you find there? And by using the steps in Journey to kind of explore this interesting place, and with a very specific theme wrapped around it. It's a crypt, so it's lots of dead bodies, but it's built by these people who are the creators of amazing technological wonders. What's going to be down there? And by doing that, I've really informed a lot of interesting places for them to see, some very atmospheric environments that they might step into, and maybe a surprise or two here and there that they might roll well enough to see, and maybe they won't. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's been really exciting to have created this campaign world that my players are just so excited about, but be able to continuously go back kind of to that gold mine of new inspiration by playing through it with Journey, and being able to pull out some of these really exciting little gets that every time I've thrown one in front of the players, it's always like, whoa, that's so cool.
No, that's really interesting, because in my later years, I have gone more and more no prep for sessions. But I do find that interesting, and I do find, because that kind of creating some of those things in advance, I can definitely see why that would, give, a lot of depth and things to it, to a specific environment or something like that wouldn't normally come out. So I can definitely see how interesting that is in that. But yeah, so like Journey sounds really really interesting. And I guess I'm just wondering too, like to maybe kind of take us back to the beginning a little bit. You said you were, you decide your setting or whatever when you come in. Is there a process for that? Is there like a random process for that?
For the actual, like the selection of your setting is kind of more open, right? Okay. It's maybe not like the most randomized thing where you're thinking like, I want to step into this place. Okay. And it could be informed by your intent. So the idea is, am I trying to understand more about a specific set piece in a novel that I'm working on? Do I want to know more about this like castle that these people live in? Okay, well, I'll step into there. Or am I more interested in the world at large? And the idea in between these waypoints is you're traveling and envisioning what it's like to move through this world, to understand more about it and become more inspired by it. And so the selection of your setting really does change very much the scope of an experience within Journey. And I've had people that their setting is a whole galaxy. I've had people where their setting has been a bedroom. Their entire story takes place in a single room, and they have used Journey to examine parts of this room and gain new information out of these very granular details. And so it's very much the selection of a setting is really a matter of defining the intent of what I'm wanting to know more about. Is it a grand scope, or is it a single room?
Wow. Okay. No, that's really interesting. The setting as a galaxy kind of gives me shivers because I've tried doing that and it kind of breaks me.
Oh, it's rough. I've dipped my toe into sci-fi writing a few times, and when I get distracted as it is doing one country for a fantasy novel, doing a galaxy is terrifying.
Yeah. I've tried that, and it's tough, but it is a fascinating, though I have to say, it is a fascinating creative exercise. Just kind of giving yourself over to the possibilities that there could be, right?
Oh yeah.
It's just it's just really unbelievable. You could do that your entire life, right? That could be a life's work.
Oh, well, so, you're telling me so far for 33 years it has, because I certainly don't have a novel to show for it, but I've got a lot of world built.
Oh, gosh. Oh, no. Yeah. Well, it took me, I guess when I was 6, I told myself I was going to write a novel, and it took me now, 41 years to write the thing. So, or at least, although I wasn't working on this one the whole time, it was, I wish, right? That would almost be good. It was like, I started 300 of them and threw them all away. Right.
What you are saying right now cuts so deep, because it's exactly my experience. I've told myself I'm going to write a fantasy novel for decades now. And I'm just like, yeah, I'll get to it, but I need to understand the currency of this place before I can write the story clearly.
Wow. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, it is funny because I had to put a lot of that stuff on hold and just get kind of the main narrative out. And, but I will tell you, so if we're giving away our ages, don't wait until you're 47. Do it. Do it. Okay. So get one of them done. And because it is even at the stage I'm at right now, and I know it's my first try, and I still have a ton to learn about putting words together on a page so that people are actually going to write or to actually going to read. I know I have a ton to learn in that regard. It's been a very rewarding experience, even getting to this point, just to say, I wrote a complete story finally for one time, and it's not 300 words. It is in the tens of thousands of words, and there we go. But yeah, I would encourage you, just finish one, get it out.
Yeah. And I think you brought up something really important, I think it's important for no matter what thing you're working on, is just do it. Just do it. Finish it. It doesn't have to be perfect. God knows I struggle with that a lot. I want it to be perfect, but it doesn't have to be. It just make it a thing that you are excited to do and to hold or to look at or whatever form it takes. Just do it because it's so worth it at the end.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with that more. And because you just never know what's going to happen when you do something or create something and put it out. You just never know what's going to happen. That actually happened with me when I started creating my game books, my books of random tables. I just put them out, and they created a life of their own kind of thing. And
I gotta say, I love your steampunk table book. I was looking at that today, and I think it's such a cool idea.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's as recording. I just released that one yesterday, I guess. So I just released the steampunk book of random tables yesterday, as we're recording this. But I thank you there for the kind words. But because I am interested, like when you were talking about Journey, I am very interested in kind of the idea of the random aspect, because I've kind of gone down more the random aspect, especially in role playing, in kind of letting dice and letting other things kind of create situations that then I have to react to as the GM. Right. And so I find that. I find that aspect of solo play, really interesting. This idea that, like you mentioned as well, you can just say, "Oh well, I won. My hero," Oh no, my hero won. Actually, I mean, I won, and I'm the coolest guy around, or whatever. But you can do that. But I think, and maybe I did that when I was young. But you kind of learn. Right. And you start seeing, you think, okay, what complication, Indiana Jones doesn't just win, right? He gets complicated, things are complicated all along the way. Right. And so seeing how those complications then can, what they can draw out of your character and what they can draw out of the story and what new places it can take things. I really enjoy that random kind of aspect to role-playing games, and because it forces me, especially as the game master, just to stay involved all the time. I didn't know what was going to happen, so okay, this is happening. I guess this is happening. What do we do? How am I going to keep my character, my players engaged here, and what are we going to face? And I think that kind of happened to me after a long time of kind of getting burnt out on GMing, where, during a period where I GM'd kind of exclusively for like 15 years and didn't play a character or anything in that time. And I realized that it was like, I needed to know, I needed to be surprised when I sat down at the table. Oh yeah. And so I kind of leaned into some of that random aspect there.
Well, it's cool. Even in an experience like Journey that's solo, there's always opportunities too for players to take and add things that they like. So after I released version 1, that was just fully digital, I had gotten, a lot of things in the book have been tweaked and changed by player feedback over time. And one of my favorite things that's been added to the book is an optional mechanic that's in the appendix called travel events. And so you have this optional thing that you can add where, as you are saying, okay, well, I'm done at this waypoint, I'm going to move on to the next one in this process. And part of the experience is that, like I said, you imagine yourself, whatever the size of setting is. If it's a galaxy, you're hopping in your spaceship and zooming off. Or if you're in a fantasy city, you're leaving this building and maybe going across town. And so you kind of envision and put yourself in the shoes of this person moving through this place. Well, you can add in an extra roll of the dice to add a little bit more random spice to it, and maybe something will happen when you're moving from one place to another. And they're intentionally pretty broad. So for one example might be that the path you're intending to take is blocked, and you need to find a way around it. And it's cool because it adds a little bit of that randomness you're talking about, and it could surprise you by what you're now going to experience. What may have been walk up the main street of this fantasy city, now you're having to cut through the alleyways. Maybe a caravan is blocking the street and you need to cut through the alleyways. You're going to see and potentially experience a fully different thing in this place than you might have otherwise. And it forces your imagination to shift and adapt. You may have already had a preconceived notion of what this main thoroughfare was going to be like, and maybe you wouldn't have grabbed anything interesting from it. But now that you're being forced to do something different, it causes your brain to engage in a different way. And maybe you're going to find a whole other part of the city you hadn't even thought about before.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I really like that idea, because I think that is something that, we kind of get lost in. And, just to even continue your example, say, your sci-fi setting, you're going down a street and it's blocked. Well, what's it blocked by? You say, robots are revolting and the police are there. And there is this, and your character or whatever, you say, oh, well, you have to turn, you have to go another way. Well, now you're in, that added already like how many dimensions to what you were just talking about, right? There's robots, they're revolting, there's danger, there's, all of these things that just comes out of something that, by randomly determining, you said, oh, well, the road is blocked by something. What could the road be blocked by? And so I really like that.
Yeah, even in a grander scale, right? You're going to maybe an asteroid field and okay, it's blocked. Well, what is it blocked by? And what does that say about the larger setting, and what can maybe it add to whatever you're looking at? There's just such a really interesting opportunity and capability to add complexity, but also depth and life to a setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds really fascinating. So Luke, where can people find Journey?
Yeah, you can find out everything about Journey on our website. It's greycastlepress.com. All of our information is on there, and you can find out how to contact me and interact with me. There is information about our upcoming game on there as well, which is still very much in early stages, but it's going to be kind of a Journey-inspired experience specifically for D&D, which has been a lot of fun to start the process on that. But greycastlepress.com is where they can find out everything.
Nice. And I will be sure to put a link to that in the show notes to this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who's listening right now, all you have to do is just head over to dicegeeks.com, find the show notes for this episode, and there will be a link so you can learn more about Journey and what Luke is up to next, because we have more in store.
Always more.
All right. Well, Luke, thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on, Matt. This has been really fun to chat with you.
All right, guys, there you have it. I had an incredible time speaking with Luke today. I really hope you enjoyed our conversation. As I mentioned in the episode, I have provided links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So you can head over there right now and learn more about Luke's solo RPG called Journey. Trust me, you want to do that. All right, guys. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you will get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in this wide, wild realm of Dice Geeks. Okay, guys, I could really use your help. If you enjoy this show, please consider supporting it in some way. You can like, rate, subscribe, review wherever you are listening to this podcast right now. Those things help the show out immensely. And some of them are just as simple as pressing a button. Just take a few seconds. So I would really appreciate it if you would do one of those things. Also, if you are a super fan and you want to support the show financially, I have a Patreon set up for the podcast. It is patreon.com/dicegeeks. You can learn how to support the show there. Again, that would be greatly appreciated. It is my pleasure to bring you a new interview each and every Wednesday. I thank you so much for listening. And until next time, keep gaming.